Greetings, students. Mr. Little here, and today we're going to look at Chapter 27, Part 2, Islamic Society in the Early Modern Era. That is society within the Islamic empires that we were just talking about. By the end of this video, you'll be able to answer these two following questions. How did the Islamic empires administer their ethnically or religiously diverse populations? And how did the geographic and political context of the Islamic empires contribute to the diversity of those empires? Let us first recap court culture. So you might remember I said earlier that these empires were not Persian and not Arab. And that is true. Their rulers were not Persians and their rulers were not Arabs, as many other Islamic empires had been previously. However, their rulers nonetheless did adopt Persian culture in particular, and Persian miniature, which is a style of drawing and a style of painting, became really popular across all three empires. And very similar to the way the Qing dynasty used their imperial portraits as a way to sort of justify their rule. These Islamic rulers in all three empires patronized artists who could do Persian miniatures as a style of painting. In addition to this, there are a number of court cultures, court traditions that reflect their nomadic heritage. So one of these is the fact that sons would be sent off to govern a faraway province at a young age to test their mettle and to improve their abilities and see if they're worthy to rule. In addition, speaking of sons, there's the unfortunate fact that until the late 1600s in the Ottoman Empire, for example, it was very commonplace for one ruler, once he became a ruler, to execute all of his brothers, just because there was the danger that just maybe one of their brothers might have a claim to the throne over them. And so this led to a lot of fratricide, the murdering of siblings. And in many cases, it led to just outright civil war, where an exiled sibling would come back with an army of mercenaries and try to take the throne. This was not a recipe for stability, but thankfully, a lot of this subsided by the late 1600s in most of the empires. But nonetheless, it's proof that there was these nomadic elements still in existence within the empires themselves. And despite being Islamic empires and despite having large Islamic titles, especially in the Ottoman Empire, but to a lesser extent in the other two empires too, rulers really did not want to put up with having to listen to the Ulama, the Islamic legal scholars. And although they did defer to them sometimes, they were more than happy to go around them with an edict known as a kanun, where they would just say, hey, I'm the Sultan, do what I say. So Persian and nomadic elements definitely in the court cultures of these Islamic empires. In a broader sense, what's important to keep in mind is all three of these empires were relatively diverse, even though they incorporated much of the old Islamic heartland in the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Central Asia. They nonetheless expanded that as well. As I was talking about, this is an age of Islamic expansion. And so they brought together other peoples that had previously not been under the influence or the dominion of Islamic states. And so all three of these empires were relatively diverse. In the case of the Safavid Empire, it was more religiously diverse than ethnically diverse. But the Mughal and the Ottoman empires were incredibly diverse. The Mughal Empire, just because it spanned most of what is now South Asia, or what is now India in South Asia, meant that it had a wide range of people within those empires. And the Ottoman Empire, stretching over such a vast area, meant it was going to incorporate many different groups of people into their empires. And this meant that the rulers had to keep that in mind. In order to be stable and effective, they couldn't just boss around everybody, and they had to incorporate their peoples from into the government so that they would feel like they had a stake in the future and the survival of the empire. What's really interesting is that later on in the 18th century, when we begin to see like posters and promotional material of empires, especially in the Ottoman Empire, they have all the different ethnic groups represented there. They have, they've got the Ottoman Turks, they've got the Greek Ottomans, they've got the Arab Ottomans, they've got everybody there. So these empires did have to go quite a ways to make sure that their local people felt included and not totally taken advantage of. In terms of culture, one of the kind of interesting thing to think about is that the Columbian Exchange was underway at this time, and it didn't make a huge impact in the Islamic empires, except in the field of tobacco. Tobacco became incredibly popular. Hookahs, smoking houses just popped up everywhere, even though some religious scholars didn't believe that this was permissible and thought that it would distract men from contemplating about God. Tobacco just became so popular and is sort of synonymous with some of the cultural practices in these regions even today. Coffee also became popular, but this leaders were also not too keen to tolerate coffee. Same as in Europe, coffee houses, it was feared, would become a place of sedition, or at the very least, a place where people would be lazy and not do work. And so rulers did try to periodically ban coffee. One Ottoman sultan even went so far as to, it might have been the Sultans of Zir, I don't remember the story exactly. He went through the capital city with a gigantic sword and just lopped people's heads off if he caught them drinking coffee. So smoking is great, but coffee will get you executed. Don't smoke, it's not good. Religion within these empires. So as I've sort of already pointed out that all three of these empires did use religion as a justification for their rule. The Safavids with their 12er Shi'ism really became key. But it's also worth noting that this is when the modern day nation of Iran becomes Shia. Throughout most of its history, what is now Iran was a Sunni dominated region. But under the Safavids, 12er Shi'ism is made the religion of the land and is made the official religion of the state. And very gradually, the entire area converts and joins this religion. And so Iran is the largest Shia Islamic state today. And in the Mughal and the Ottoman empires, they had very large non-Muslim populations, and so they continued this Dhimmi practice, where people paid the Jizya in order to can be allowed to exist, except in the Mughal Empire, as a matter of practicality. We also see in the Mughal Empire two other really interesting developments. One was under the Mughal Emperor Akbar, the growth of something called the divine faith. That is, Akbar sought to bring together and blend syncretism, right? Sought to blend together all the world's religions into something he called the divine faith. And he sort of kind of said that he was a prophet of the divine faith. Nobody really adopted it, just a few court nobles, and it sort of died with him. But he did build a really interesting kind of audience hall called the Ibadat Khana, where he'd have people come talk and discuss and just discuss religious stuff. And so he had Hindus and Jains and Zoroastrians, and he had Shia Muslims, and he had Sufis, and he had Christians, everybody, all the religions of the land were allowed to come to the Ibadat Khana and talk about religion with the Sultan. There's some very funny stories about, groups having debates, Christians debating Muslims in the Ibadat Khana and poking fun at each other or trying to poke out the inconsistencies of each other's religions. It's a very interesting. I would encourage you to do some research on it if you're curious. One other really interesting development in the Mughal Empire in particular was the rise of the religion of Sikhism and the Sikh community in what is now northern India and the region of the Punjab. This in part was the creation of an incredibly charismatic guru or prophet or kind of a guru named Nanak, who made a very bold proclamation that there was no such thing as a Hindu and there was no such thing as a Muslim, and this was the creation of the modern Sikh community. Now, in most study guides, in most AP World related literature on Sikhism describes Sikhism as a strictly syncretic religion. And while it's undeniable that Sikhism has elements of Islam like monotheism and it has elements of Hinduism like reincarnation, that Sikhism as a religion has many unique elements. And it would be a terrible mistake to just call it a syncretic religion. That said, it would also be, you would have to be blind not to see the influences of both the other major religions on Sikhism. Nonetheless, I do want to be clear, Sikhism is its own religion, and the Sikh community built its own culture. It has its own history, and that history, especially when it came to its relationship with the Mughal empires, was very unstable. It got along with some of the earlier emperors, but later on, especially with Aurangzeb and some of the later Mughal emperors, the community did not have such a great relationship. There were 9 gurus, and of the 9 gurus, I believe 4 of them were killed either fighting the Mughals or were captured and killed by the Mughals. So the Sikh community had a very tough, rough relationship with the Mughal Empire. Eventually, they formed their own empire for a very short time in northern, what is now northern India and the Punjab region, but it didn't last very long. But that said, Sikhism is I believe, the 5th or 6th largest religion in the world today. Most Sikhs either live in London, in the United States, or in India. That's where you can find most Sikh communities in the world today. In a broad sense, when we talk about women in society, In general, while women continued to enjoy the advantages of Islamic Sharia law, which included some things they didn't have in Europe, such as the ability to inherit property, as well as sort of a workaround by which women could establish a business, it provided that they had to have a male intermediary actually doing the business for them. In general, women continue to play a very traditional role. Rather, these empires were all rather conservative culturally, so women generally just kind of continue to play very traditional roles. In the courts, that was a little bit of a different story. So all three of these empires, their rulers had what we call harems. And in the West, we usually think about harems as like a ruler has a number of women who serve him at his whim, at his desire. But that's not always the case. And a woman in the harem could potentially get their child by the sultan. You should know that sultans and shahs and kings oftentimes have many children. But if a woman in a harem could get her child promoted to the throne, that could not only make the child the sultan, but potentially give the mom lots of influence and lots of power. This did happen quite often, and for about 100 years, the Ottoman Empire was effectively ruled by women from the harem, or former women from the harem, who put their sons on the throne and then effectively got them to run the empire for them. This is referred to by historians as the Sultanate of Women for about 100 years. This also happened, I might add, in the Aceh Sultanate in Southeast Asia, where you had a great male leader named Iskandar Muda, who extended the empire to its greatest extent. But then immediately after him, you had 4 female rulers, sultanas, who ran the empire. So it's worth noting that in the Islamic empires, you did see a lot of female rulers, sometimes in a very intense amount of time. But even when women didn't exactly run the empire, you had instances of people like Jahan, who was the last wife of Jahangir, the Mughal emperor, and she effectively just ran the Mughal empire for the last years of Jahangir's life because he just didn't really feel like running the empire anymore. And so she pretty much, historians largely agree, she pretty much ran the empire for him. This, in addition to running a very profitable pilgrimage business, where she basically would sponsor pilgrimage ships that went to Mecca, taking pilgrims. So at the societal level, fairly traditional. At the court level, though, women could play a very large role in the politics of these empires. This is a painting of the Ibadat Khana. And these guys in black right here are Christian Jesuits, and this is the Emperor Akbar. So this is a very famous painting. This is a European depiction of what they believed a harem would look like. No European male that we know of ever set foot in a harem. I believe, and I could be wrong about this, a European female may have set foot in a harem. I don't remember for sure if that story is correct. But almost every painting that you see in European artwork of like a harem is definitely fictional and not in any way, shape, or form based on reality. But in this case, this one is interesting because here we have this woman enjoying some coffee. Again, kind of representative of that continued increasing trade of coffee becoming popular in the Ottoman Empire. Like all major land-based empires that we've looked at so far, the Ottoman Empire, Mughal Empire, and Safavid Empire did engage in large building projects. Sometimes these were to demonstrate power, sometimes these were to demonstrate piety, sometimes these were to demonstrate wealth. For example, the Ottoman Empire sought to demonstrate its piety via the construction of the Suleymaniye Mosque, which is really interesting because the Suleymaniye Mosque looks like the Hagia Sophia because they combined traditional Islamic geometric patterns that you would see in mosques with the Byzantine dome architecture of the Hagia Sophia. It's kind of an interesting little bit of syncretism there, architecturally speaking. Shah Abbas built his new capital of Isfahan, not just to demonstrate his own power by building, at the time, the largest mosque in the empire, and at the time, and even today, the largest bazaar in the empire, a 2-mile long non-stop bazaar, 2-mile long market. It snakes through the city. But also, so not just his power, but also to encourage traders to come to Isfahan, right? Come to Isfahan, sell your goods at Isfahan. We got a 2-mile long market, right? What could go wrong? It was even said for a while that if you saw Isfahan, you saw half the world. Like everything you needed to see in the world was in Isfahan. The Mughal Empire also built a large number of very famous buildings and building projects, things like the Red Fort, which was a strictly military building. But the most famous one that you've probably heard of is the Taj Mahal. And I guarantee you can picture it even if you don't know what building I'm talking about. It was a tomb, although it does look like a mosque, which is sort of a reference to the Islamic nature of the Mughal Empire. If you go on the inside of the Taj Mahal, you will find inscriptions from the Quran that have to do with loved ones and death, because it is a tomb for the wife of one of the Mughal emperors, Tas Mahal. I believe, if I'm remembering my chronology correctly, she was the wife of Shah Jahan. And these large buildings are a testament to the power, the piety, and the wealth of all of these empires. When we talk about technology, it's important to keep in mind these empires, their main technological focus was on weapons, firearms, cannons, guns. It was Mehmet the Conqueror who commissioned these massive cannons to knock down the walls of Constantinople, which they didn't actually end up doing. But nonetheless, it's a reminder that military technology gets better when rulers want military technology to get better. The case of Taqi al-Din is a really interesting story when it comes to science within the Ottoman Empire. Taqi al-Din was an astronomer. And he, interestingly enough, also designed a steam engine, although he didn't think to apply it to like moving things. He meant the steam engine to roast meat. That was the idea. He was going to make an engine powered by steam that would roast meat to just the right amount of time and right temperature, a self rotating split for a piece of meat. Very smart man. And he built an observatory in Constantinople. And he actually witnessed, what's really interesting is he witnessed what's called the Great Northern Comet, which was also witnessed by Tycho Brahe in Northern Europe. They both witnessed this comet at the same time. But what's interesting is that while Tycho Brahe managed to get the sponsorship of the King of Denmark in order to build an observatory, Taqi al-Din made the unfortunate error of predicting victory in an Ottoman campaign that didn't end up going very well. And so he kind of fell from grace. And then later on, after his death, there was a small earthquake in Constantinople that more conservative individuals said this is proof that this observatory is offending God. And they went and they tore it down, and it was never rebuilt. So it's sort of unfortunate. There is a great Persian miniature of work at the observatory that is the record of most of what we know about it. Other improvements did occur. So, for example, in the Mughal Empire, they created the rolling mill, which is sort of a sugar press, which was borrowed by Europeans and used in some of their American colonies. When we talk about technology in the Islamic empires, sometimes discussions are made of like the printing press and questions of conservatism, right? They were so conservative they didn't have a printing press, and we contrast this with like the effect of the printing press in Europe during the Reformation and the Enlightenment. But there's a couple of things that kind of get lost in this comparison. One is that one of the major reasons why they didn't have a printing press was that they didn't really need a printing press. Not that many people could read at the mass level, and this was true in Europe for a while too. And they had a network of scribes that would copy things, and so there wasn't really any need for a printing press. There were some genuine fears that the Quran would be mistranslated if it was sort of just left up to anybody to print things. There was this fear that the Quran would be mistranslated, and also the fact that Arabic characters, which were in use in the court and most written language at the time, and even in Persian, which was being written in Arabic too, it's sort of hard to make those characters work in a pre-modern printing press. So there were a lot of factors that came together that prevented the printing press from being in use. And even when it was finally unbanned, it was only being used by, I believe, and I could be completely wrong, it could be the Greeks or it could have been the Armenians, might have even been the Assyrians, but it was one of the non-Islamic minorities within the empire was using the printing press. And so, in general, the lack of support for scientific advancement, unless it had to do with guns or weapons, it definitely sort of put a bit of a hamper on technology. And, if this had been in an earlier period in history, this may not have mattered as much. But as you're going to see at this time, it's going at the exact same time as in Europe, the scientific revolution has taken off and the industrial revolution is about to take off. And that's going to have really definitive consequences down the road. So something to keep in mind. This is This is a painting. This is a Persian miniature of Taqi al-Din's observatory. Note all the astronomical instruments. You have an astrolabe right here. You have a measuring staff right here, or it's called a star staff, I believe. You have a nice big old globe down here too. Kind of interesting. You see a lot of astronomy stuff at work here. And this is the Shah Mosque in Isfahan, which is connected to the large public square. So across from this is the large bazaar that I was talking about, the 2-mile one. But anyways, I'd like to thank you for joining me for this. I'd like to thank you for joining me for this bite of history. I hope you have learned something. And my name is Mr. Little, and I will see you next time.